Okay, so good afternoon and welcome everyone to another Systemic Diversity and Inclusion Group discussion panel. Today's discussion panel is sponsored by Diversity Frontier and our Systemic Diversity and Inclusion Group on LinkedIn. Diversity Frontier is an equality, diversity, and inclusion strategy consulting firm. We deliver contextually relevant solutions in order to create culturally responsive and mutually respectful and inclusive outcomes for our clients, and we also collaborate with SDIG to provide a safe and open and inclusive engagement and awareness space for all. So we encourage all of our members to share ideas, to engage in research, to learn from each other, and to discuss local and global inclusion practices. So today our panel is on policing and new recruit training. And I would like to start out by introducing our president and founder of Diversity Frontier, Dr. Noye. If you could please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background.
Thank you very much, Maggie. I want to thank the chiefs, Menino from Chicago, where I know are close to Chicago, and Brian, thank you very much. And Medrin, thank you too. Well, we are in the crossroad, and I essentially just want to introduce myself as someone who had been provided the opportunity to work with people from various parts of the world. And that shaped my view that in this world of ours, just as Brian was saying, that in his community, all voices are to be heard. And that underscores the relevancy of United States more when you compare them to other places, because that they give us opportunity to express our views, and maybe we could disagree sometimes, but ultimately collective efforts could lead us to best solution or best result at the end. So my name is Joseph Noye. I'm an educator. I've worked in a number of places, including at Illinois State University, where I taught for almost since then. I'm very passionate in issues associated with diversity. I had developed the first international conference for diversity at the Illinois State University. There I worked as a director of Center for Cultural Diversity, where I took my students to other places and gave them the opportunity I was afforded when I was growing up. That is, getting to know people. The problem in this country, to me, if you are familiar with my book, is that we have what I call artificial walls. These artificial walls demarcate people. People on one side of the wall don't know the other people on the other side of the wall. So what they do is to concoct disparaging things that sometimes is unimaginable and use it to make judgment about them, and vice versa. I don't care where you are, but if you have a situation where you divide like that, you create the forum for hate, for negative things, manufactured ones against one another, and ultimately it doesn't lead to good solution. So the purpose of this systemic diversity is essentially to provide people the kind of opportunity I've had all my life to get to know one another. And it's difficult, it's not an easy task, because you have to literally sort of deconstruct the already constructed ideas of one another, and then reconstruct the one that is based on facts in order to get to know one another. So I'm not gonna go too far. I know Maggie will be saying it's too much. So on that note, I give it back to Maggie.
Okay, thank you so much, Joseph, for that. And if the rest of the panelists, we could start with Chief Pete, and then just go down the line if you wouldn't mind, and introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Brian Pete. Very proud and humbled to be part of the SDIG. I am the current chief of the Montpelier Police Department in Vermont, with previous assignments in Alamogordo, New Mexico, the Office of Special Investigations in the Air Force, and the Chicago Police Department, as well as the Chicago Office of the Inspector General.
My name is Christopher Menino. I am Chief of Police in Park Forest, Illinois. We are a suburb of Chicago, located in Cook and Will County, so just south of Chicago. And I've got 23 years in law enforcement. I'm a graduate of the FBI National Academy, hold a master's degree in political and justice studies, And when it comes to the topic of diversity, I am on the Illinois Association Chiefs of Police Diversity Committee. It's an ad hoc committee that was just formed this year, so I'm glad to be on the inaugural committee. And essentially, we're working to get more Illinois police agencies to endorse the historic agreement between the NAACP and the Illinois Association Chiefs of Police on 10 shared principles of policing. These are 10 foundational principles that both organizations agree on. And so we are working to get additional agencies throughout our state to endorse those principles and not just endorse them, but put them into practice. I'm very glad to be a part of this conversation today. Thanks for having me.
My name is Dr. Jeremy Butler. I'm Assistant Professor of Health Promotion and Performance at Justin University in Elgin, Illinois. I'm also the owner of Pagoda Rebirth Martial Arts. Before coming to Judson, I was a police officer at Illinois State University for about 7 years. During this time, during this time, I served as a verbal de-escalation instructor as well as the control tactics instructor for not only my department, but also as part of the mobile training unit, which is the regional training in Illinois for departments in our area, Central Illinois. And then my doctoral research focused on the impact of Academy defensive tactics training on officers' confidence, and then also looking at recommendations from veteran officers on police training reform, specifically focusing on non-lethal use of force.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you so much. And thank you to our audience members for being here today too. And if you are coming on just a few minutes late, if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we will get to as many of them as we possibly can during this discussion forum. So to start this out, this is the second official policing panel that we've had. We've had a few informal ones within the SDIG group. This is a very, very important topic to people globally. And we know there's a lot of negative press, there's a lot of emotion that's behind this issue. And our goal is to really take an objective look and kind of deconstruct each piece of this, because it's not just defund the police, or it's not just abolish the police department, or it's not just keep everything the same. It's deconstructing each piece of this issue in order to better understand it, and what better way to do that than from the people that are living it every day, so I'm very grateful to our panelists that are here. So for today, we want to take a look at the new recruit training and whether or not is that something, in your opinion and in your experience, we need to restructure? Is that what is causing part of the issues that we're seeing today in policing? And I know, when I first met Brian, you were in the middle of new recruit training, I think that week, and you did a quick Zoom call with us from the car. So I know that you're very involved in that piece of it. So maybe you could start us out with kind of explaining what new recruit training kind of looks like. And I know it's different for every organization, and what you think needs to change.
Okay, that's a very heavy question, and it's a justifiable question. I think I'm looking at the entire premise of law enforcement and everyone demanding, and to include people within the department. I mean, Chris is an extraordinarily progressive chief. So progressive chiefs are starting to become popular. They're starting to be recognized for the changes that they want to make. And I think within those circles, it's always been an understanding of institutional change. Coming in and saying, I'm here at the lowest level, I'm a blue shirt, whatever, but if I ever made it to this point, these are the types of things I would like to change and like to address. And I think that the culture is the huge part of it. And culture starts at the academy. And I'm betting Dr. Butler has a lot to say about this, but I think that training is instrumental in establishing a culture. And when Dr. Butler had mentioned an officer's confidence in training, I think a lack of confidence can negatively stem officers in different directions. If you don't have that circle of understanding of what you're doing, if you don't have the confidence, if you don't have the tools and the resources, you're going to kind of default to those artificial walls. You're going to default to the things that you've learned and what your experiences have taught you up to this point, where those expectations aren't there. You're coming into a profession that your peace should never be disturbed. So education in our training, our frontline training is essential and what it is that we're supposed to be doing. And each state has an academy that they're supposed to send folks to with pretty much the same amount of experience and expectations, law, defensive tactics, everything else with hours devoted to it. But I'm especially ready to hear what other folks have to say about that.
So if I could interject for just 1 second, Brian, if you could explain to us, like, how long is new recruit training typically, and what does that look like?
It's an hours base. So I guess for just in generalities, it normally ranges anywhere between 3 to 4 months in different circles, depending on where you're at. Some states have part-time police officers that only have to do maybe a quarter of the training that a full-time police officer might have to do, but expectations to do the same job, but not given the same amount of tools. So like, for example, in Vermont, there's a part-time police officer program that's only consists of 1 week. And officers are going out there, and there are certain things that they can't do without other officers present, but they're still given 1 week of training to go out there to do stuff, the training that's arguably already condensed and compacted that may not be enough in certain areas, depending on where you're at. So it's, but that boils down to itself systemic problems as to if that academy is being supported, if it's being funded with the correct amount of resources, or if they're being driven by political motivations or anything else.
It's so, wow. So 1 week, I'm still trying to process this 1 week kind of training compared to other career fields. And Dr. Butler, is that the same experience that you've had?
Well, yeah, so I can speak specifically for the state of Illinois because that was sort of my area of focus. Like Brian said, it does vary. Generally, standard academies are 3 months in Illinois for your standard full-time position. But I know state police, they have a 6-month academy. So it really does vary based on where you're at. And that's I think that's one limitation of the whole structure is everything's so different in terms of even the nature of the training. And I don't understand why, because I mean, in my eyes, police work, it should be universal, because the responsibilities are generally universal. If you think of a patrol officer, you understand, even your basic layperson understands what responsibilities generally are: protect and serve, being able to respond to calls for service, and being that peacekeeper in the community. But I think that, the fact that we have, like we said, a variety of standards in terms of how long you should be in academy, standards in terms of what you should focus on, how the learning process is established. Like some academies, they have blocked training where you'll spend 1 week, 5 days straight on defensive tactics, and you don't do any of that again for the rest of the academy. Then you have other academies that is spaced where you'll have, a 4-hour session during week 1, a 4-hour session in week 3, and another session, all throughout the academy. And considering the amount of information that we have on best practices for learning, I think that, it's interesting that we have so many different avenues that people are taking rather than focusing on what is the evidence-based practices and using that to guide us into a more uniform way of doing things. I don't know if that answered your question directly, but.
No, it does. And I think when I talked to Chief Menino the other day, you had talked about the fiefdoms, right? So there was 18,000 different organizations. Are there 18,000 different ways of training new recruits?
Yeah, so, and that's one of the fundamental problems, I think, with policing and law enforcement in the US is that we have nearly 18,000 different law enforcement agencies. So that makes standardization impossible, certainly on a national level, but even on a state level, it's really not possible under our current system to have any kind of standardization. Now, in the Chicago region, we are limited to only a small selection of training academies. And those training academies are 560 hours, which is accomplished in about 14 weeks. Contrast that to when I started, I attended the Chicago Police Academy, which was a side academy for suburban areas. It was a 10-week academy. And now I've been speaking with one of our former officers who was hired in 1950. His training consisted of being driven around the village, given some keys and a handgun and handcuffs, and he was policing that very same day. So we've had this slow progression of adding to our training over the past 70 years. But even where we're at today, it is completely far from ideal, and it's absolutely contributing to some of the issues we have in law enforcement in American policing.
So Chief, then what do you think is the number one issue? Because this is what everybody wants to ask, and I think people are afraid and nobody wants to be impolite, but everything that you could think of that's negative about policing is splattered all over the news media, right? And we know that's a small piece of what's going on, but it's definitely what's on the forefront of everybody's mind. And I think, even my experience in the military is that one bad apple is one bad apple too many. And so what do you see in this new recruit training that needs to change to make sure that those bad apples don't get in the first place?
So this is to me, the answer has such a difficult answer because, well, let me back up. 2006, I went to Germany, to Cologne, Germany to study policing there. And Cologne, Germany is the biggest city in the state of North Rhine-Westphalia. North Rhine-Westphalia is the biggest state in Germany. And the way policing is done in Germany is there's a federal police, the Bundespolizei, which are basically transportation and border police. But all the other policing, the standard policing, is done at the state level. So there is no Cologne Police Department. It is the North Rhine-Westphalia Police Department who's assigned to Cologne, Germany, or maybe they're assigned to a small suburb, but they're all under a state agency. If you become a German police officer, your training is a minimum of 2.5 years. Now compare that to the Chicago region where your training can be 14 weeks. And when I say 14 weeks, that's 14 weeks in the classroom, followed by about 12 to 14 weeks of field training. So 28 weeks, a half a year total of training. Compared to the German system, it's a night and day comparison. And look, let me be clear. The strength of American policing is the American police officer. The man and woman who fills that uniform, I will put our police officers as individuals up against any police officers in the world as far as character and quality of the person. But we do them a huge disservice by putting them in this training system where they're thrown through in a 14-week, maybe even a 6-month period, and they're put out in the street. And we expect them to make life or death decisions in complicated and dangerous circumstances that evolve rapidly. And it really is unfair to the men and women we have doing the profession. And many of us who rise to the ranks successfully, a lot of that's due to luck. And a lot of those who get caught up in something bad, it's due to bad luck, a bad situation, things unfolded fast, and they simply weren't prepared well enough. So when you ask what's the solution, in my mind, the ideal solution is a training program and a policing system that's closer modeled by some of the ideals like Germany has. The problem with that is, as you already mentioned, with 18,000 individual police departments, it would be virtually impossible under our current system of policing to have a 2.5-year training program. I've got 41 officers in my agency. When we have a vacancy, we need that vacancy filled quickly. And when we go to our recruit list, we get them in the academy, we're looking at 6 months before they're able to actually go out in the street and patrol as a functioning, self-functioning police officer. And we simply can't operate if we had to wait 2.5 years to get a person online. So it would take a fundamental restructuring of American policing to reach what I believe is an ideal situation of having a much more robust training program that involves classroom and field work and theory and really invests in our human resources. We're not investing nearly enough in the men and women we're putting in uniform right now.
And for the other panelists, feel free to this should be a very open conversation. So I don't want to guide all of it. I would really just love to hear what all of you have to say on each of these topics.
So I agree with what Chris said, and I think that kind of hits on that idea of the standardization is yes, under our current infrastructure, it's going to be extremely difficult to try to make some of these changes. It really needs to be I guess, a complete revamping of the way we do things if we want this to happen. And that takes time. That takes a lot of resources and a lot of people being involved. So it's not a process that's going to be able to happen overnight. And I think that that's going to be the biggest struggle is getting everybody on the same page and in agreement on what this looks like. And then the time that it's going to take to make it work is what the struggle will be.
And I agree with Dr. Butler. With what he's saying about that is to me that Chris hit something really. It's not necessarily, it's a disservice to the community when we're sending people out there who are probably unprepared or undertrained in what they're supposed to be doing. But it's a huge disservice to that individual because whether they get into criminal and administrative problems or whether they lose their lives because we haven't given them the training or the tools they need to be successful in what we expect them to do and what we want them to do out there. And I think that what Chris had said that, you know, it used to be, hey, here's drive around the city, here are your keys, your gun, your handcuffs, go to work. All the way up to now, 14, 18 weeks, 6 months of training is an understanding that we have in the past not given our staff, our people, enough training. And now we're coming to an understanding that this job requires more than just report writing tactics and everything else like that. There's a human element that when you're dealing with something that integral, it takes significant more experience in moving forward. And so now I think all that's left to do is we understand what the problems are. We just have to embrace it, and we have to have that courage to standardize these things. And there was a question on there asking about, so what's the certification level? Well, normally the states handle those certification levels. They set guideline or minimum standards as to what they expect officers to be trained in and how they're tested and how they pass and get that certification. But one of the other critical elements that I think of is emotional intelligence. Does that person have, you know, first you hope you catch people getting in through that grade. Did they pass all the tests? Did they pass the background test? Some places have polygraph tests, and those are scary. But, you know, once they get through that, do they have the emotional intelligence to come into a situation, a life's experience, that you have something extremely personal that's going on with a family? And can they identify and empathize? Do they have that life experience to empathize and identify to come up with the best possible solution to de-escalate something and move forward from it? Or are we putting them out there and just saying, here's your training, and they're thinking, I've never dealt with this before, my training says this, maybe I do or don't have enough training, and here's the decision I'm gonna make.
So I'm glad you brought up the emotional intelligence piece. And I listened to Chief Menino's podcast the other day, and you kind of combine that with the behavior piece. So in the new recruit training, is there any sort of training piece where they have to learn about behaviors, not only their own behaviors, but the behaviors of other people, which is critical? Because I think you were mentioning in your podcast, you know, when you walk into it is a very complex situation usually, right? So it's not just cut and dry, and there's usually a lot of emotion, a lot of activity. And are these officers trained to recognize the behaviors? Like, what are the behaviors saying to us? You know, somebody running away, what is that behavior saying? Or if there was somebody in Vegas, and we talked about this in a previous panel, that was selling water, and he got arrested multiple times, and he ended up being injured by the police officers. And I don't know that anybody ever actually looked at the behavior. The behavior was telling us that this person doesn't have money and it's his way to survive. And he's probably willing to take a bazillion tickets, right? In order to keep making some money. And so Chief Menino, you had talked about, you know, police officers going in and understanding what the behaviors in that incident, in that moment, are telling the officers so they know how to respond. Is there training already set up to teach that kind of applied behavior analysis?
There's limited training in the academies on topics like that. But when you have a 560-hour police academy, the majority of the focus is going to be on fundamentals like what the law actually is, officer safety, use of force. So if you looked at a comparison of the amount of time a new recruit spends in use of force training versus how much time they spend in emotional intelligence related training, it's going to be extremely out of proportion. It's in favor of use of force. And, you know, use of force training is critical to the role of law enforcement officer, but so is emotional intelligence, so is behavioral analysis, so is civil rights. And while civil rights are covered in the police academy, they're not given nearly the amount of hours that use of force is. So the only way I think you can get this balance is if you have a much longer training period where where there's time to focus on these issues and give these important topics the due resources they deserve. It's just there's not time. And right now, the focus of Academies is to take a civilian and turn them into a police officer in a set amount of time as efficiently, as quickly as possible. And, I'll say it again, it's really not fair ultimately to the officer or to the community. And my hope is that we can eventually do better here.
Well, I wanna first of all thank you guys for various ideas you've presented. I think part of the problem is that perhaps, I don't know, you may not have the kind of forum you need to have in order to highlight all these things. But I also want to go back to the debate, federalist system and state rights, where in some cases we say, well, this is the standard. And some people say, no, there will be no standard. That's actually, if you begin to look deeper into it, could explain why certain states, there's like ubiquitous mistreatment of people based on their color, based on where they come from. And that's because, as the chief said, there are not enough time to prepare these people on issues of civil rights of individuals, especially those who may have been treated or historically been treated so badly. And that bad treatment can be seen morphing in various forms, whatever form it comes. And when some police officers who had been groomed to see these people as something less, that will explain why their antenna goes up when they see certain people. Whether it's conscious or unconscious, it doesn't really matter, because the impact to the victim is immense. So as I think about these discussions going on, I think that they should look into standardization. They certainly should be listening to the police chief who are really groomed into it, who know the in and out, not politicians coming out sometimes without no good reason to say this is how it's gonna go. I think that if the people should begin to communicate, say like the chief who went to Germany and learned that some of them were doing their training for 2.5 years, if I'm correct, and then compare it to relative 4 months or whatever number of weeks they have, and then you give them the gun and say, go. Well, I think that they really need to think deep and come with rational reasoning. Because when people who may be critical of police saying defund them, abolish them, if they don't understand, they don't have any vintage view to see what you guys see, the struggle you guys happen to find yourself all the time. And oftentimes you become the football for playing games. Like, I see these things going on, and I think that the politicians, community members, police, all these groups should come together to begin to look at all the downs and falls, or look at those things and then come up with the kind of strategy that will go. I often say that police is now being used as a scapegoat for societal problem. We have societal problem of race. We have societal problem of connection. If you are connected, you get all kinds of perks, but if you're not, you're gonna be suffering. There has to be standardized way of being fair to everybody. And if you adhere to that, that will be very helpful in shaping a police department that the community will respect, and then vice versa. Thank you.
And I have a small point of contention to what to the idea of emotional, us not having enough time in academy training to really focus in on emotional intelligence. I do think it's possible, and I think a good example of it being successfully implemented is particularly at the academy that I attended, and it's also the academy that I did my research on, is the Police Training Institute at the University of Illinois. And this goes to a sort of a controversial topic. I've gotten into several debates with fellow police officers on the idea of the paramilitary model in police academies versus the adult learning model. So many police academies implement this paramilitary model where it's almost like a boot camp. And my thing is, what are we reinforcing if these officers are spending 14 weeks in an academy where they're getting screamed at and where they're getting disciplined, and then they go out into the street and you give them this authority? Like to me, there's this sort of deeper message that often can be conveyed subconsciously, that this is how you handle people when you're in a point of authority. Whereas using the adult learning model, where the idea is focusing on developing the ability to be an effective community-based police officer. So one way that is used at the Police Training Institute is the training is all interconnected and interrelated. So while we may not, I think when a lot of people think about emotional intelligence training, you think about sitting in the class and having a session on learning about emotional intelligence. Yes, that's done, but then we apply it in scenarios. So at that academy in particular, there's generally some scenarios basically every other week. So it could be, you know, a basic taking a theft report. What are the procedures for that? And they have role players. So the officers is acting out exactly what would happen and how it would happen. But so if you learn that in week 1 and we fast forward to week 7, we're working DUIs, the actors in the roles, they're still presenting issues that will force an officer to exercise their skills of emotional intelligence, right? So while understanding that this person is potentially going to go to jail, that doesn't mean that we don't treat them with dignity and respect. That doesn't mean that we can't be empathetic of whatever their life circumstances are. So I think one solution to that is, rather than just thinking about it as, let's have we need to have more sessions of learning about emotional intelligence, whatever topic you're addressing, try to interweave the principle of it within, that training. So that way it's consistent throughout the academy.
Dr. Butler, if I could ask you a follow-on question to that, because I hear this all the time about the police, the law enforcement being a paramilitary organization. And I think most of you know, I spent more than 20 years in the military. And I think one thing that we learned, and I went through both enlisted and officer training, is that we use all of our tools of diplomacy. So it's never just the use of force, right? So we learn how to do nation building, community building, leadership, collaborating with local communities. So how much of that is built in to the new recruit training of not just the, you're saying in yours you had the EQ training, but are they being taught from the start that when you approach a situation, and I'll give you my example, I have a child with severe autism. I was just on a trip and I was literally terrified because of her behaviors that somebody was going to call the police, and not because the police were going to mishandle her, but because they didn't have the initial training to recognize she's not a danger, she's intellectually disabled and acting out. Where the military does train us that we have to observe all the behaviors to kind of understand. So in your new recruit training, are they being taught, okay, well, maybe you understand where the person comes from, but are you bringing in social services? Are you, are they training with these other organizations to help support? Because it can't be all you. It can't be all in the law enforcement to be the psychologist, the nurse, the social worker, the educator.
Yeah, for sure. Now, in terms of whether or not it's being addressed, again, that's going to vary by academy in terms of what is the point of emphasis. I'm pretty sure again, when I speak, I want to speak on the state of Illinois. I don't want to speak on other states because that's not my area of knowledge, but I know in the state of Illinois, we have several minimum standards by state for what needs to be taught. Mental health is a part of that, learning about mental health awareness. And so there's a certain trainings that have to be fulfilled in order to even, function as a department after the academy and during the academy. So I know everyone generally addresses a lot of these issues, but whether or not it's truly value or truly, let me not say value, I think it's value, but whether or not it's truly emphasized and reinforced, that's going to vary by department, that's going to vary by academy. But yes, everybody gets exposure to these elements, but I think the points of emphasis is going to vary.
And if I could, Dr. Butler had brought up, when he's talking about the difference between paramilitary and adult training, one of the key differences between the two, and this goes over to to Joseph's point about that this is a systemic issue, overarching to everything, is that at least in the military, when you have that drill instructor, they are trained to do the paramilitary training concept, and they're told why they do it. When you come into a Chicago Police Academy, it's almost like, so the culture is, I had to go through it, and I'm not gonna say hazing, but I'm gonna say that I had to go through this level of stress, I had to go through, so you're not even trained on how to do it right, how to observe when you're overstressing somebody else, you're just doing, there's no training in that. And so I think that's one of the differences there, and then that stems back to that culture that Dr. Butler was saying. And so when you get out there on the street, you kind of default that, hey, I guess I'm supposed to have this type of mentality, this very robotic, just the facts, ma'am, or just whatever it is I learned on TV or what I saw in the academy. This is what I have to do in that form of emotional intelligence. And I think that gap is even constitutionally recognized. It's now, to me, it's known as emotional intelligence, but when we talk about officer discretion, that's something taught in the academy. And when you ask anybody what is officer discretion, you're gonna get a whole bunch of different answers on what it's supposed to be. And officer discretion is ultimately, what is the best decision that I could make based on what I understand about what's going on in this situation, life experiences, or what the system is set up to do. And to me, that ability to have good officer discretion is based on your experiences, your training, and how you see life and your emotional intelligence and understanding about yourself.
So I'm gonna take a quick question from the audience that I think is not necessarily a question that we can answer, but it's a question that we need to start trying to answer. And so one of the audience members asked, who's critiquing the training and the trainers at these police academies? And it says, this sounds like a landscape of powerful people who are accountable to no one. And how do we address training to redesign it? Because it is a systemic issue. So I know it's a very big loaded question, but I think it's a conversation we have to at least start about what do we do next? How do we fix this? What do you need from us, in the public? So as law enforcement servants, I'm grateful for the work that you do. What can I do, in my space? What can Dr. Noye do in his space? Some of the audience members, we have people that are C-suite members. What can we all do to help you with this?
I think the Band-Aid would be to have longer training academies with more time for some of the curriculum that would address these issues. To get back to Dr. Butler's point that they can and they do teach emotional intelligence at the academies. I don't doubt that at all. But just to give you an example of what I'm talking about, in the German police training, they have an entire course on understanding the history of Nazis and how the police helped bring about that system and that ideology. And they even have to, in Berlin, they have to visit a former concentration camp as part of the training. Imagine if we could devote an entire semester to a course in the police academy on understanding the mistreatment of people of color by police, the history of that, and really diving in deep. Because what I find is a lot of officers, especially white officers who come from predominantly white communities, it's not that they are against movements like Black Lives Matter and that they have these racist ideologies themselves. It's that they are honestly completely unaware of what the real history of policing is and that relationship between police and communities of color. And we've done a terrible job of taking the 23-year-old kid from a predominantly white suburban community and putting him into a diverse situation with no knowledge and no real concept of what has occurred and what the perspective of a person of color might be when they meet that officer. So that's why, in my mind, a much more robust police academy where we can have in-depth topics like this, where we can have people of color who've been impacted by racist actions of police or unfair actions come in and speak and talk about some of their interactions, how they've been negatively impacted by interactions with police. This would go a long way to prepare all of our officers for going into diverse communities and policing in a way that is fair and impartial. But again, to me, if we extend it from 14 weeks to 18 weeks or 14 weeks to 6 months, that's not nearly enough in my mind to have a ideal product. And by product, I mean an officer ready to go into the community and serve and protect. I would much rather see a much longer 2, 3, even 4-year program. But again, we're talking about fundamentally changing law enforcement. So what I'd like to see worked on first would be consolidating police departments. We have far too many police departments. We have police departments literally with 1 or 2 people who comprise that entire police department. We can do a lot of consolidation that would help towards standardization, and that would help towards this problem of not being able to afford to have somebody or a position vacant for 2.5, 3 years. But that's a big ask, and that is a big change to ask for in American policing.
Thank you, Chief Menino. I think the point you made here is very critical for almost in every aspect of the society. Right now, I get notes from my former teachers who said that they couldn't believe what they see in school, where some teachers will come, the first day, they determine who will pass their class or who will fail the class. Now, these teachers don't have bad intention. They don't have any bad malice, but the social infrastructure in which they've been socialized ingrained that view that certain people cannot do well or some people could do well. And that becomes the driver on how they behave towards these people. Now, as you mentioned in police, it's very unfair, extremely unfair, to get people who had been socialized to look at certain people, if you recall what I said about the artificial walls. And that's where it began. It's like the air people breathe, the food they eat, the people they socialize with, everything gears towards shaping them into ingrained view that certain people are what they are not. But guess what? Hence it's ingrained, that's their belief system. You cannot divorce your belief system from your behavior. And that goes to everything, whether you're talking about healthcare, that women of color are dying during childbirth at a significantly much more higher rate. Whichever dimension you look at is the same pattern. So I urge you to continue what you are doing in that your small circle. Do the best you can, because I think the thinking is objective one. The training you talked about in Germany is what they need to teach police on. In fact, someone had written me this morning. Now I've had it. I wanted to send it to Majid. The question was, do the police know the history? And the person was alluding to how police was used to restrain people. And some people still have that understanding. That could explain why some people may see police and run away. They have their concept of what the police may do, which may be not in alignment with what police will actually do. And then we have to figure, how do we get these things into the minds of people, especially those in position of power, to provide adequate training, because they are doing the service to these young people, knowing how the society has constructed their view or participated in constructing their views. And if they do that, I think things will be better. And thank you very much for that point.
Doc just brought it down to the whole institutional level, and it's in highlighting the systemic issues that are within policing. But he's right. I mean, that focuses back on the same question could be asked of how do you change educational practices in the west and south sides of the city of Chicago? Because are you bringing the most qualified people in? I mean, people with seniority, arguably the ones with the most training and experience, are not in the neighborhoods that could use that experience the most. They're bringing in people who are, it's a seniority-based issue. It's a culture-based thing. And you bring in somebody fresh out of college to come in and teach on the west side where kids are coming with much more different dynamics and social problems as related to somebody who may be in Beverly in the city of Chicago. So it's I think it's an institutional thing that with our training and how we look at trying to change it, Dr. Butler just keeps hitting home to me, because when you're looking at adult-based education, when you're looking at best practices, I mean, we learn most when we have fewer people in one class, and you can ask those questions and you can get this one-on-one experience. But the hurdle to that in law enforcement is, do you have enough people or recruits to make it financially viable to have an academy? Or do you just send 3 people in one academy? Well, that's not gonna, we're not getting the bang out of our buck if we're only able to send three applicants to the academy. In the meantime, you may put somebody on the books in the police department and have them on the books. They can't even go out and patrol, but you've hired them, and you've got them for 3 months before you can even send them to the academy in a lot of the smaller departments. So it's just, I think it just takes bravery and just resources, or just bravery and understanding to make the best of the resources that we have available to us.
I think what I, continue to hear every time we have one of these panels is that, they're all huge systemic issues, right? And Chief Menino, I'm all about the big ask. So I'm the girl that will go ask people for the help and the support and beg and pressure until you get it. So I think those of us that have the ability to try to do that, we have to do that, because it sounds like there has to be from a top-down kind of support, but then also at the tactical level, where you're in it every day and having the right support there. I didn't even realize until yesterday I had a meeting with the D&I person from Walmart, and I didn't know Walmart had committed like $100 million to working on diversity issues. And one huge component of that is the law enforcement and policing piece. I'm like, well, how come we don't know about that? Why doesn't society at large know that that piece is there? Because this is how we can connect you at that local level with people that have power, control, and money to kind of help these things. So I will always keep begging for anybody who can help get out there and start making those connections and asking for it. And I think what I'm hearing you say is, Dr. Butler, this is a multi-generational change, right? So this is not going to happen probably in our lifetime, but it has to start now. It has to start now. And like Chief Menino was saying, people have to understand the history. We have to understand the behaviors. We have to understand all the intersectionality of these things across all these local communities. So, I go back to what can Dr. Noye do? What can I do? What can our audience members do starting today? What can we do to help you with this?
So, again, I come back to the big ask of, we needed a new model, I think, or a better model of policing in America, and that starts with the training. Going back to the German model, where an academy is closer to getting a college education, 2.5 years. But in the meantime, if that is the multi-generational solution, the shorter term solution I see as making sure there's adequate funding for appropriate training for our police departments, which, that's the opposite of unfunding or defunding. That is more funding. But here in Illinois, we, prior to the unrest over the death of George Floyd and prior to COVID-19, we already had severe funding shortages for training. And we have a long list of training mandates in Illinois for officers. Some are every 12 months, some are every 36 months, some are every 5 years. But they're unfunded mandates, and the money for training is going down. So what we need in the short term is enough funding to adequately train both our new recruits and ongoing training for our personnel. And I don't know that's going to sit well with people who want the exact opposite, who want police to be defunded. But if you want better policing, it's going to take more time and more resources to get a better end product. I think it starts in the police academy. I think it starts with a longer, more robust police academy. I don't disagree with Dr. Butler at all that a adult learning model is probably a much better model of training. I wouldn't be opposed to an initial boot camp style training, maybe to initiate recruits for a much longer program, but then it transitions into an adult learning. And as Chief Pete brought up, that it's explained why the discipline is instilled in that first portion, and then we go into an adult learning model. But all this is going to take a lot more resources. So if you ask, what can you do? It's talk to your legislators, stress how important it is that we get our officers adequate training, both at the initial phase of coming out of the job and continued training. I mean, I even look at chief of police training. There's no there's no official mandate for police chiefs. I mean, we have to have 20 hours of continuing education, but there's no official certification process that's mandated to become a chief of police. Some states have voluntary processes, but it's not mandated. And some of us go to the FBI National Academy, some go to another program like Northwestern or Southern Police Institute, but that's not required. You could have a chief of police even who has very little education and not even that much experience. It could be a political appointment. So this issue affects all ranks.
So again, we've talked, and I keep saying we talk about this, but it's because these are systemic issues. Every time we have a panel, no matter the topic, a lot of these things overlap. So when we talk about the fact there's no deliberate development of leaders, that speaks to education, that speaks to corporate. The only place it doesn't really speak to is the military, because that's been so formalized over the years. But I continue to find that there's no deliberate development of these leaders through these systems, right? So maybe if you're, in a sheriff's department, it's an elected position. So you could have had next to no background, and next thing you know, you're the sheriff. Or, the comments you made where people hang out long enough and you get the job. So would that be part of the new recruit training, is to start identifying recruits early on for those potential leadership roles, and also funding that right along the way? So we have this pool we already know has leadership potential, and now we need to make sure we have funding to deliberately develop them along the way. So then, as we all age out and retire, we have these right people with the right culturally responsive training and skill sets in place to take over the next generation.
I think the only struggle with that idea would be the fact that the academy is so different from actually being on the field. So a lot of times people will excel at the academy, do really well at the academy, but then they get on the street and it's just, they find out really quickly that it's not the job for them. Or they don't make it through field training because, there's theory and there's, classroom work and there's practice. And then there's the reality of being in that situation and experiencing the pressure. And some people just crack under the pressure. So while I like that idea, I think that would be something that would have to occur maybe through the field training process and after a little bit of experience is established versus the time at the academy. Just, based on what I've seen, and I haven't been I wasn't in law enforcement that long, but I'll tell you what, like in those 7 years, a lot of people, didn't make it once they got out of the academy. They didn't make it through the field training. So.
Oh, understood. And we are almost at the end of this hour already. So these go so quickly. So I want to make sure the four of you are able to give your final thoughts to the audience. And we will start with you, Dr. Butler.
I guess my closing thoughts, I would say, one, I think we need, as we kind of spoke on, this new culture, and really a culture that values training, and that's not just the fulfillment of the minimum state requirements, but we need people in leadership that establish a culture that really cares about preparing the officers for the demands of the job. And I grew up in an environment where resources were scarce. I grew up in an underprivileged community. We made it happen on limited resources. You do what you have to do to make it happen. So I feel like the idea of not having adequate resources, yes, that's an issue, but I think there's always a solution if you really try to work through it. So you have to make best with what you have. And then I think the other big point is making decisions based on evidence-based practices versus political decision-making, versus pressure from, just from the political infrastructure. So really looking at the data and looking at the research to drive decision-making within departments is big.
Okay, and Chief Menino?
Yeah, I would just reiterate what I said earlier. The strength of American policing is the men and women who are doing the actual job. I mean, we have some true heroes in law enforcement. We're very fortunate as a country that overall we've got some high quality people doing the job. Where we go wrong, I think, is that we don't give them the foundation that they need, an adequate enough foundation through their initial training and ongoing supports throughout their career. And a lot of that is due to the nature of policing with 18,000 separate police departments spread out across the country, many of them doing things vastly differently. Some doing things very well, but some admittedly not doing very well. So ultimately, if I can wave my magic wand, we would have a system of policing much closer to what we see in Europe in some places, and where you have much more consolidated policing, a much bigger pool, and much more standardization. Until then, I think we have to focus on getting our people, these incredibly good people that we have doing the job, the best training that we can, and supporting them throughout their careers.
Hey, Chief Pete.
I would just say that, that we're looking at the problem that we're at right now. How we got here was our culture. And if we want to change that culture, if we want to make institutional systemic change within law enforcement, it starts with training. And for the same level of research that we're pushing or pouring into use of force, crisis intervention training, everything to that is the same level that we need to do things like what Dr. Butler has done, is looking at our training foundation, and are we using evidence-based practices? I mean, there's a lot of other places that are getting it right and how they're training professionals. Are we doing those same models? Have we brought them over in our areas of training? And so I think that for culture change, the foundation of training is the first part of it. It's the first sense of exposure. And it kind of brings me again to that default that there was a question that was asked, what are the outside influences? And well, when I came into the Air Force, we looked at Top Gun, and that's what we thought pilots were like. And for people who see policing, when they're watching TV, they see Police Academy, they see NCIS, they think that's what policing is like. So it's incumbent upon us to make sure we set those realistic expectations and we have solidified training.
Thank you. And Dr. Noye.
Well, I want to first thank all of you. And I would really go back to training. We focus on the kind of training that matters. That sometimes people will engage in training driven by political processes, the kind of training that tend not to even add any value. It's interesting that Menino discussed about going to Germany, learning about the Holocaust, learning about the horrible things that happened there. And it brings me back to how often are these police officers trained on the pain and anguish African Americans endure every day. You may say, well, the slave days are gone. But if you fast forward to this particular point in time as we are discussing, you find out that the residues of those things still come in the minds of some people, both the Blacks who may have had stories of victimization. It doesn't get out from their heads. It somehow impacts their behavior. The same happens to people who had been taught, directly or indirectly, that certain people are the criminals, like going to the store, like Walmart, where you see an African American, the person is being watched. I'm saying this because I had students who did tests to ascertain all these things, and they are factuals. So the point is, are they doing the kind of training that will help them? And if they're not, as Maggie said, why don't they find a way to get the political juggernauts who usually do things that, quite frankly, sometimes I just shake my head when I look at some of the politicians and the type of decisions they make. Are there ways you can influence your governors? And those of you that are in national police organizations, are there ways you could articulate these points? Because by just sharing the idea, some of them who truly want to be fair to all could take something out of it and do the best they can. But ultimately, it requires rethinking, collaboration, finding people who can provide you the type of roadmap that will help you in your doing your work. It's very unfair that a lot of people don't know these things, so everything will be police, and sometimes it's easy to scapegoat them. And that's not the way we should go. We should go for truly understanding and learning and gaining opportunity to do what we need to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So thank you, Dr. Butler and Chief Menino and Chief Pete and Dr. Noye. I'm personally just very, very grateful that you're willing to come to have these open and very difficult conversations. And obviously nothing's going to be solved in an hour, but we have to start. And we will publish these, and there's people that want to help. There are people out there that want to help support you. So we are grateful for the work that you do. I know it's not an easy job, and it's often a thankless job. So I want to thank you personally for everything that you do and everything that your officers do. And I hope that you will come back for future discussions, because we are going to probably have dozens of these. So thank you to the audience, and I put our websites in the chat box. You can find me on LinkedIn under Margie Crow and Dr. Noye, so feel free to connect with us, and I wish everyone a blessed day. Thank you so much.